Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Steve Falk. I'm the Communications Director for Citizens Climate Lobby. And we're going to talk about meeting with editorial boards at your newspaper. And so first question that would probably pop into everybody's mind is, well, why do we want to meet with newspaper editorial boards? And so there's a number of reasons why we want to meet with editorial boards. We generate our political will through the publication of letters to the editor and op-eds and so forth. As powerful as these are, they do carry a great deal of weight with our members of Congress. An editorial endorsement for our policy carries the greatest influence because it represents the official view of the newspaper. So when candidates run for office, they often get interviewed by editorial boards in the hope of getting an endorsement for their election. So when a newspaper endorses a particular policy or legislation, elected officials and those who are running for office, they take notice of that because it could be a factor in securing the newspaper's endorsement in the next election. So newspaper editorials, of course, also educate and influence their readers. So an endorsement from the newspaper can influence and motivate constituents to support our policy and communicate their support to members of Congress. So moving on here, from time to time, Citizens Climate Lobby will send out what we call media packets for our volunteers to pitch to editorial writers. And the aim of those media packets is to get the newspaper to write an editorial talking about our solution. So by meeting with the editorial board, you dramatically increase the chances that A, the editorial writer will actually look at the media packet, and B, that they'll write something that reflects our perspective. So by meeting with the editorial board, you establish a relationship with a contact at the board who is then more likely to return your phone calls and also respond to your email. So moving on here, what are the objectives in meeting with editorial boards? So as I mentioned, the primary goal, the brass ring, if you will, is that we're reaching for is an editorial endorsement for CCL's proposal of carbon fee and dividend. Now, if you get an immediate commitment for an editorial, great, but there are other objectives for the meeting. So some of those other objectives would be to establish a relationship with a contact on the editorial board, to have them perhaps consider writing an editorial when our legislation is actually introduced, and perhaps maybe even get a commitment to publish op-eds periodically from your chapter. And you also want to offer your group and CCL as a resource for the editorial board so that whenever they decide, hey, we're gonna write something about climate change today, they might come to us for information. So why do we want to meet with the editorial boards after the elections? So the elections right now are dominating the opinion pages. So to try to meet before the elections, probably number one, you're not going to be very successful at getting a meeting because, as I said, they've got all these candidates who are parading through their offices at this time. And there's not going to be much that's going to be discussed besides the elections on the editorial page before November 8th. But after the elections, the thoughts are going to turn to the agenda for the new administration and the new Congress. And this is going to be a good time for us to look at what are the possibilities for getting something done in the next Congress. So, and it's also a time when newspapers, usually at the end of the year, newspapers determine what their editorial priorities are going to be for the coming year. So you can, see about whether or not the newspaper is going to put climate change on their agenda for the coming year. And then there's also the reason that we want to meet after the elections is that we kind of want to prime the pump for getting their support for our legislation in 2017. So next, what about getting a meeting? How do we do that? So the first thing you'd want to do in trying to secure a meeting with the editorial board is to find out who the editorial page editor or the opinion page editor is at the newspaper. And you can usually find that information fairly easily on the newspaper's website. Usually on the home page, if you scroll down to the bottom in real teeny type, down at the bottom, there'll be a link that says Contact Us. And if you go to that page, there's usually a link to a staff directory. You should be able to find who is the editorial page editor, what's their email, what's their phone number, and all of that. So that would be step one, is to find out, okay, who is it that I need to request the meeting with? How do I get a hold of them? That's fairly easy. The next thing that I would do is to look for an opportunity in the newspaper to interact with the opinion page editor. So in that sense, requesting a meeting with the editorial board excuse me, is very much like looking for a letter to the editor opportunity. So if you're reading the newspaper every day and you see something on the opinion page that kind of relates to the climate issue or the climate solutions or something like that, it's a great opportunity then to send your note to the opinion page editor, because they just wrote something. It's usually the best time to interact with a journalist is when they've published something and you respond to it. I mean, they're human beings. When somebody takes notice of what they do, it lights them up and they're more likely to respond to that. So when you're writing to the opinion editor, what do you want to say in that request for getting a meeting? So first thing you would do is to introduce yourself and Citizens Climate Lobby, and then acknowledge something that they had in the paper. That's a good way to sort of open up the conversation with them. And then after you've acknowledged what they've published in the newspaper, you want to get into the reason that you want to meet with them. So you might say, hey, with the elections over after November 8th, it's time to talk about what the new administration and Congress can actually accomplish. And we think 2017 is the year that effective bipartisan climate legislation can be passed. And we want to enlist your help to make that happen. Can we meet with you? So that's kind of the basic outline of the note that you would send to an opinion editor to request a meeting. Don't make it too long. I wouldn't go more than about one page or so. You get past one page and people are, oh God, I don't have time for this. So try to keep it as concise as you can, but also make a strong case for why they should be meeting with you. So then we come around to planning the meeting. So once you have a meeting set, schedule a time to get together with your team, the people who are going to go to the meeting with you, and talk about your agenda, your strategy, and the roles that you want to assign for participants. So if you haven't, already researched the newspaper's editorial position on climate change and policy, this would be a good time to do that. You don't want to go into a meeting with the editorial board not knowing what their position is on climate change. It really doesn't make you look very well prepared if you don't know what they've been talking about on the issue. So in the resources section of CCL Community, we have also a suggested agenda for the meeting. And so at your planning meeting, decide on different roles that people are going to take in the meeting. So you've got people who will be the facilitator, people who will be a note taker. You will have briefers. And let me explain the briefers. You want to assign topics that each of your members will be responsible for covering if questions arise on that stuff. So you might have somebody who can do a quick laser talk on the REMI study, for instance. You want to have somebody who can, do the quick overview of what carbon fee and dividend and those sorts of things. And the idea here isn't so much that you're going to have everybody do all these laser talks. It's more that you want to be prepared and you want to know who will handle the questions when they arise in the meeting. So you may want to include a community leader as part of your delegation. Be careful with that. If you do that, you may want to have somebody who's a business leader or an elected official or maybe a faith leader. That's great. That's great to have somebody influential with you in your meeting. But if you do that, make sure that they're on the same page with our policy, and also make sure that they're clear, what the agenda is. You don't want somebody coming in and just kind of hijacking your agenda in the meeting. So a person of influence is great to bring into a meeting. Be careful. So next, we'll take a look at the agenda and the meeting plan. So rather than a presentation, where you're just doing all the talking, what you really want to do is have a conversation. But you want to have a conversation in which you've provided the context, so that you can steer that conversation in a certain direction. So there's a great temptation to tell them the things that we want them to know, but we really have to tell them the things that they need to know. But we don't know what they need to know unless we have a conversation with them, a back and forth in which we are listening to them. This sounds very much like the way we conduct our meetings with congressional offices. It's kind of the same thing. So a good meeting, therefore, will be one in which you do half the talking and the editorial board does the other half. So after quick introductions, a little about CCL, and acknowledging some of the things that the newspaper has written, we're ready to get the conversation rolling. So moving on here, so what's the context that we want to have for that conversation? So I might say something like, there's been a lot of movement behind the scenes in Congress on climate change. We believe Republicans are ready to support a market-based solution, and you can provide the political cover for them to step up. So we're going to share some information that we have, and then we'd like to have your thoughts. So, so after kind of that opening statement, then there's a little bit more to setting up the conversation. You want to provide them with the information that they need to be asking questions. So you'll definitely want to go over what our proposal is, carbon fee and dividend, and a quick overview of the REMI study, which talks about the benefits of our policy. And then you want to talk a little bit about the progress that has been made in Congress. Most people, and editorial boards included, probably have this perception that absolutely nothing is being done on climate change, and that the parties will never get together and all that. No, there's some things that have been happening behind the scenes that people don't know about, like the Climate Solutions Caucus. So you'll definitely want to tell them a little bit about that, a little bit more of the context that you want to provide is to mention the Paris Climate Accord, which was agreed to last year in Paris, and now just recently enough countries have come on board with ratifying that agreement that it will go into effect on November 4th. But so the U.S. Has made commitments for this Paris agreement on climate change, and the U.S. mechanism for meeting that commitment, however, is the Clean Power Plan, which it's an executive order, and it's very tenuous. It's also insufficient. It's kind of subject to to the whims of whoever happens to be sitting in the White House. So the bottom line is that we need something better. We need legislation that is effective and also has broad support. So now that you've provided the context for that conversation, it's time to get the ball rolling on that conversation. So, let's talk a little bit about, getting Republicans who we know that there's Republicans who want to step up. And the big thing that the newspaper can do is to provide the political cover for those Republicans to step up. And that's where the newspaper can come in, and where an editorial endorsement can really give members of Congress who want to do the right thing, but they're afraid that it might have some political ramifications for them. The newspaper endorses a policy and encourages them to step up, then that increases the chances that they will. So after you've established that context for the conversation, just say, hey, what do you think? What are the questions that you have? And so the conversation will be rolling along then after that. And then moving on, as the conversation winds down, there are a few things that you will definitely want to make sure that you handle in the meeting. Don't let the meeting end without taking care of some specific things. Number one is you'll ask the question and you'll want to get the answer. Will the newspaper endorse carbon fee and dividend? Next thing you'll want to know is who is the person on the editorial board who we should be in touch with. Who's our contact? You'll also want to ask if we can be a resource for the editorial board when they're weighing in on climate change. And then also ask them if they would consider accepting submissions for op-eds from your local CCL group, and then just thank them for their time. So that's pretty much the meeting. One of the things that I'd want to caution about is that sometimes the conversation can get off track in a meeting, and what you want to do is avoid going down the rabbit hole. So if that starts happening, if an editorial board member starts going off on some weird tangent or something like that, you want to get the conversation back on track, but at the same time you don't want to be insulting or anything. So in a very gracious way, you might just say something like, this is a really interesting discussion, and I wish we had more time for it, but there's really some other ground that we need to cover on this. So, like I said, just try to avoid the rabbit hole in the meeting. And then the last thing I want to mention here is what I call the Fourth Estate pep talk. And this is to sort of remind the people at the newspaper, what their calling is, what their true purpose is. And so this is my a nice little speech. You can kind of do a variation on this, but this is sort of what I would say is before we go, I want to acknowledge the critical role that you, the press, have to play in solving this problem. You are, as I'm sure you're well aware, the fourth branch of government in our democracy. You're the branch that lights a fire under the other branches when they fail to do their jobs. The founding fathers thought this role was so important that they put freedom of the press in the very first amendment to the Constitution. So right now, Congress is failing to take action on climate change, and it's a failure that jeopardizes not only our nation, but the entire world. You can't sit back and watch it all fall apart like some bemused third party. This is a fight that you need to be in. This is a time when it's absolutely essential to fulfill your role as that fourth branch of government by holding the other branches accountable. We have a solution that is simple, effective, and easy for all sides to embrace. And we hope that you'll do everything in your power to inspire, prod, shame, and motivate Congress to make it a reality. So, so after the meeting, you might want to huddle up a little bit and do a quick debrief. You'll also want to follow up with a thank you note to the editor. If you've promised them any resources, of course, make sure you follow through on that. And most importantly, you know, start cultivating that relationship with the contact on the editorial board. And so, you know, that might mean every couple of weeks, just you know, sending them a quick note to acknowledge something that you like that they had in the paper. But, you know, just as I say, start developing that relationship so they don't forget who you are, so that when, you know, it comes time that we have a new media packet or another request, you know, we can go to them, and as I say, we'll get our emails returned, we'll get our phone calls returned, and that kind of thing. So that's it.